Even if you've never actually heard of Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, and I think most of you in this room have, you've surely heard her most famous quote, the opening line to an otherwise obscure 40-year-old article about Puritan funeral services, which said, "Well-behaved women seldom make history." However, inadvertently, that quote has made its way around the world on bumper stickers, greeting cards, and not a few signs that have been carried in marches recently. Laurel Thatcher Ulrich is the 300th anniversary university professor in the history department at Harvard University. She is, in short, one of the most celebrated and decorated American historians of our time. Her second and most famous book, A Midwife's Tale, The Life of Martha Ballard, based on her diary, won virtually every conceivable honor bestowed on historical writing, including the Pulitzer Prize, Bancroft Prize, Dunning Prize, and several others. It was made into a television program that some of you may have seen on PBS. Ulrich's several other books, including Good Wives, Image and Reality in the Lives of Women of Northern New England, 1650 to 1750, The Age of Homespun, Objects and Stories in the Creation of an American Myth, and yes, Well-Behaved Women Seldom Make History, are all regular fixtures in undergraduate and graduate classrooms. Dr. Ulrich has made her impact not only through her scholarship, but also through her extensive leadership and mentorship. She's served as president of the American Historical Association, the main organization for the Guild of Historians in the United States, and the Mormon History Association, where I've been privileged to work alongside her and see her wisdom in action. In addition to her professional work as a scholar of early American history and women's history, Ulrich has written extensively on her native faith of Mormonism. Her book, co-written with Emma Luthane, All God's Critters Got a Place in the Choir, is a gem, and her essay, Lusterware, is one of my personal favorites in the genre of Mormon essays. Along with a group of other women living in Boston in the 1970s, she became a pioneer of modern Mormon feminism. The various strands of Ulrich's life have come together and found fruition in her new book, A House Full of Females, Plural Marriage and Women's Rights in Early Mormonism, which is conveniently for sale in the foyer. I don't know if any are still on sale. We might have sold out. I'm not sure. And so her lecture tonight will draw on that recent research, and we're so pleased to welcome Professor Ulrich here to campus, so please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you to Claremont Graduate University and to all of you. I'm delighted to be here. I think I've been here a couple of times in the past. I always enjoy it. Wonderful audience. And I'm particularly happy to be here tonight to talk about my new project. But I wanted to call attention to the cover and to the subtitle. The subtitle, Plural Marriage and Women's Rights in Early Mormonism, 1835 to 1870. And I'm going to talk this evening to one aspect of that. I'm not going to be talking in great deal tonight about plural marriage and how it came about. Perhaps you can ask questions about that if we have a question and answer period, if I don't tell you enough about that topic. I'm instead going to focus on another theme. And I'm working with, as I think many of you know, some of you were in a workshop this afternoon, I've been working with diaries, a wide range of diaries, to try to understand early Mormonism pretty much from the ground up. Rather than focusing on the founding prophets, try to understand how people understood themselves in their own letters and diaries in that period, 1835 to 1870. Wilford Woodruff was just an ordinary Mormon when he began his diary, later became a president of the church. And the cover of the book makes use of this beautiful calligraphy in Wilford Woodruff's diary as a kind of frame for a fascinating painting. This painting is at the Springville Art Museum in Utah. I don't believe this painting has ever been used as an illustration in the book. I was ecstatic when I found it and very excited when my publisher agreed that it would go on the cover. And it sort of interests me that the border that the designer put around the painting, coming from the diary of a priesthood leader in the church, framing a domestic scene, a very important domestic scene. The painter, C.C.A. Christensen, is probably familiar to those of you who know a little bit about Mormonism. He painted great panoramas of the crossing of the plains, handcart pioneers, scenes of the American West. But this is a small genre painting that he painted when has still in the original frame as a gift for his good friend, celebrating the birth of a baby. And it's called Weighing the Baby. And if you look closely in the center of the picture, you will see the women there with the weights and putting the baby in a kerchief and to determine the birth weight of the baby. It's a charming picture. It is a house full of females. And let me tell you, there are not many pictures from this period that show this kind of a scene. A house full of females. It could have been a painting illustrating women 200 years before that. It could have been an illustration of scenes, changing costume, of course, from a different century, from my book, A Midwife's Tale, which was about an 18th century Maine midwife. It illustrates a number of aspects of female culture. Women are taking care of other women. They're facilitating birth. They're at the same time watching their own children. Imagine this after the birth scene, the little toddlers walking around and one reaching up and trying to touch what may be his sibling. And I think that is a little boy in a dress, which was common in that period. And the other toddler greeting his father, who comes through the door holding a whip. Well, the whip, I think, symbolizes I rushed to get here to find out that I had a new child. So he's whipping the horses to get to the scene. But he's an outsider. He's looking in on a world of women. You see other aspects of female culture in this painting. Childcare, birth, yes, but also domestic economy. The mirror, the neat clothing hanging above the bed, the homemade quilt, very similar to some quilts made out of homespun woolen in this same period. The domestic scene, the interior scene, the community of women. One of my favorite details in this painting is the little old gray-haired lady, about my age, sitting in the back, and if you look very, very closely, she has a pipe in her hand. And I am told that my great-great-grandmother, who was an early pioneer to Utah, who had come from West Virginia, had a long time habit of smoking a pipe. So I love that painting for another reason. We know a little bit about the family being illustrated here. The man in the door has two wives. which made him typical of plural marriages in 19th century Utah. The vast majority of those polygamous families had 2 wives. There were usually someone was a very important man in his small community or in the larger territory to have more than 2 wives. Very few had more than 4. The famous ones, of course, Brigham Young, we know about. His 27 or 19, they're constantly changing the numbers of the number of wives that he had. So this is a community of women that is so like communities of women worldwide, where women are responsible for health care of children, for care of children, for birthing children, fundamental reproductive labor presided over by women, who have a female economy of production and exchange, who have a kind of bonding together through common biological and social circumstances. This is a community of women like hundreds of communities over time, and like in some places in the world today. It's an unusual female community in the 19th century in that it has polygamy. And I want to really emphasize that point, the ways in which the Latter-day Saints were fundamentally like and radically unlike many of their neighbors. So what I want to think tonight and have you help me think through is the puzzle that I introduce in the introduction to A House Full of Females. The puzzle of plural marriage and a remarkable transformation in 1870 when the territory of Utah gave women the right to vote. And when Utah women stood up in massive indignation meetings held in 58 towns in the territory, massing 3,000 or 4,000 women in the old tabernacle on Temple Square in Salt Lake City, and defended plural marriage in terms not only of their rights as Americans, but their rights as women to choose their own husbands. The nation was astounded. And the question was asked at the time, continues to be asked, how could it be that women could simultaneously support a national campaign for political and economic rights, which they did, while defending marital practices that to most people seemed relentlessly patriarchal? At one level, the answer is obvious. They were being threatened. Their community, their loved ones, their whole economic and religious basis by draconian legislation which had passed the U.S. House of Representatives and threatened to pass the Senate, which would have disfranchised and imprisoned Mormon men and denied women the ability to testify in behalf of their husbands. They, by standing up as women, these plural wives defended their homes and their religious identity. They were not forced to do so, or even asked to do so by male leaders. It was their idea, and that's well documented, and they planned the meeting in a meeting hall that they had built and funded for themselves. So it's a case of competing identities, something that we see today in many circumstances. Some people look, for example, at Muslim women. such as one woman who served as student body president at Harvard, who continued to cover her head according to Muslim tradition. She was simultaneously asserting her identity as an educated woman and a leader in her community, and her identity as a faithful Muslim woman. And it's no more paradoxical that she would do that than that Latter-day Saint women would stand up for a religious practice that seemed to deny them equality, and at the same time assert their identity and their belief in their religious system. So in part, that's what this book is about, but I go further than that. That from the very beginning of the church, because of the conflict that Latter-day Saints often had with neighbors that resulted in violence and expulsion from their homes, from the very beginning, female as well as male leaders knew how to circulate petitions, sign affidavits, lobby public officials, and employ the power of the press. They had been touched by reformist ideas, by radical ideas of the 1830s and 40s, including the astounding idea that a woman should choose when and with whom she would bear children. By embracing Mormonism, these women had shown a willingness already to push against the grain, but they were tough, they were relentless, and they were willing to be different. As Latter-day Saints, they were victims of ignorant and sometimes willful misrepresentation by outsiders. But they were surely exaggerating when they claimed to have experienced nothing but liberty in Utah. As their own writings attest, they had endured both the condescension and the open opposition of their own leaders. Is this a surprise? In the 19th century, female abolitionists stood beside male abolitionists to fight against slavery, and yet found themselves diminished and unable to attend certain meetings or speak on certain platforms because there were women. So Latter-day Saint women experienced sexism. Wow, surprise, at both the national level and at the local level within their own community. And it's this latter part of the story that I want to talk about tonight, rather than the part about the embrace of plural marriage and the embrace of women's rights. What was it like within this religious community? Where were the dimensions of power and authority, and how did those function? And I'm going to do that, and I hope I can do that in an economical way. I've already talked quite a while to explain you the framework of the book, but I'm going to try to take a quick trip through 10 illustrations from the book. So this will be the pictorial description of one strand of a house full of females. And what I want us to think about are the various dimensions that are at issue. So the first one that I put up here, I'm calling sisterhood. It's all the stuff I was talking about in terms of the painting. Women identified as women working together in the domain of neighborhood and family. But there are other areas where Latter-day Saint women operated in a religious framework. One was in what some would call the priesthood of all believers, that spiritual gifts are accepted or available and accepted to those who believe. And Latter-day Saint women operated in that realm from Kirtland to as far as my research extends. Another is charity. Women not just doing for their neighbors and themselves and their own family, but reaching out to those less fortunate and engaging in charitable work. Not much problem with those things with Latter-day Saint women or with others, but they're there and they're profound from the beginning. Where it begins to get a little more interesting is whether Latter-day Saint women could actually hold office, to be engaged in some kind of management or leadership position in the church. And we'll briefly talk about that. And then finally, the domain of ritual, which in many religious institutions is dominated by men. Administration of sacraments, administration of religious rituals. The final one, which I put in gray, is not really going to be very much about my story, although it's important to the larger book, is citizenship. Just plain old citizenship in the community. Okay, let's see what these 10 objects look like. Gotta tell you, give you my quote and my title, and then we'll look at the 10 objects. The title for the talk comes from a discourse that Brigham Young, the successor to Joseph Smith, the founding prophet, gave on March 9th, 1845 to the 70s quorums in the church at Nauvoo, Illinois. And he gave a similar talk to the high priest quorum. These are quorums of men who hold the priesthood. When I want sisters or the wives of the members of the church to get up Relief Society, I will summon them to my aid, but until that time, let them stay at home. And if you see females huddling together, veto the concern. And if they say Joseph started it, tell them it is a damned lie, for I know he never encouraged it. Women huddling together. What on earth is he talking about? Well, he's talking about the formation in 1842, on March 17th, 1842, of the Nauvoo Female Relief Society, which was the first formal organization of women in the Latter-day Saint Church. This was an organization which gave women office. And as one of the participants, the men who were there to formally applaud the organization of the Relief Society said, the church was not properly organized until the women were organized. Here they were with a formal position in the church. And Eliza R. Snow kept the minutes of the first Relief Society and carefully recorded sermons that Joseph Smith gave to the sisters. Brigham Young, I might add, never attended any of these Relief Society minutes. So I don't know what Joseph told him on the side, but here's what Joseph said according to Eliza's minutes. He said the Relief Society president and her counselors should preside over the society just as the presidency preside over the church, and that if they needed additional officers, they should be appointed and set apart as deacons, teachers, etc. are among us. At the third meeting, he promised to make of this society a kingdom of priests, as in Enoch's day, as in Paul's day. And then he went on in another meeting and affirmed the importance of spiritual gifts, which had been there since Kirtland as long, and probably came with sisters who had come from the Methodists and some other groups as well. That is speaking in tongues, prophesying, healing the sick, the gifts of the Spirit as enumerated in the New Testament. Then Joseph Smith said to the society that they should get instruction through the order which God has established through the medium of those appointed to lead, that is, their own leaders, the presidency that have been chosen. And I now turn the key to you in the name of God, and this society shall rejoice, and knowledge and intelligence shall flow down from this time. In Latter-day Saint thinking, a key is the right to exercise authority in an area. I turn the key to you to organize this society, to appoint officers, and to do the work that you choose to do. Powerfully important message. And within a few months, there were 1,300 members of the Relief Society. Joseph Smith's wife, Emma Smith, was president of the Relief Society, which brought the authority of women and the authority of men into the same household and brought a lot of trouble later. Okay, first object, the minutes of the Female Relief Society, which were preserved lovingly through all kinds of trauma and concern to the present day, and can be read in facsimile and in transcription in the Joseph Smith papers online. Okay, second object, Nauvoo Temple. This is an embroidery which was done in England and by women who had never seen the Nauvoo Temple, which was under construction for a very long time and completed after Joseph Smith's death in 1846. And you know this was completed after Joseph Smith's death because it lists the members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles who were leading the church after the death of the founding prophet. Now, this was, we think, a kind of fundraising project that had been established shortly before Joseph Smith's death, and it was called the Penny Fund, in which the Sisters of the Relief Society were to contribute a penny a week to purchase glass for the windows in the Nauvoo Temple. And what's fascinating about this Penny Fund, which was advertised throughout the world, including to the mission field in England, is that it was announced in a general conference, not by the Relief Society, but by Hyrum Smith, the prophet's brother. And he had recently taken a plural wife. He was now married to two sisters, Mary and Mercy Fielding, who became responsible for administering the Penny Fund. And he said this, which is a very strange statement. No member of the Female Relief Society got it up. I am the man that did it. They ought not to infringe upon it. I am not a member of the Female Relief Society. I am one of the committee for building the Lord's house. What happened here? Well, what happened was an emerging conflict in Nauvoo over plural marriage. Joseph Smith had taken a couple of dozen women as plural wives. We don't know what kind of relationships these were. They may have been spiritual sealings at this point, but they were considered to be sealed to the prophet Joseph Smith, and they ranged women older than Joseph Smith, women much younger than Joseph Smith, all of whom were known for religiosity. One of those women was Eliza R. Snow, who was the secretary who kept the minutes for the Relief Society. And There were beginning, it was secret. The practice of plural marriage was totally secret. Hiram had resisted it and then had been persuaded and had become an enthusiastic supporter. But increasingly, Emma Smith, the president of the Relief Society, was concerned. And she, in March of 1844, promulgated a statement urging a moral reformation in the community and exhorting the church to correct the morals and strengthen the virtues of the community. And she held meetings of the Relief Society, two sessions a day, to read a statement composed by one of her friends. And she said, if there ever was any authority on the earth to conduct this campaign, she had it. She urged the sisters to heed Brother Joseph when he preached against vice, and she reread to them a letter he had written a number of years ago when someone had charged immorality among the brethren. She asked for reformation in both men and women and invited them to affirm their support by raising their hands. At this point, only a few of the 1,300 members of the Relief Society knew anything about plural marriage, though some had surely heard rumors. And those who were ignorant about the practice were no doubt reassured by Emma's campaign. Those who were themselves plural-wise, including Eliza and other members of the Relief Society leadership, probably considered their sealing sanctioned by God and therefore perfectly moral. But Hiram was not happy. And when Joseph Smith was murdered, a couple of months later in Carthage jail, Brigham Young was irate. And he believed that Emma had whipped up opposition to her own husband and therefore was somehow responsible for his death. And that's why he didn't want the women meeting again. He dissolved the Female Relief Society. But he went ahead and continued to work with the temple. And in the temple, there was a special group called the Quorum of the Anointed, who had been meeting for months, even before the temple was complete, to master religious rituals, which they would officiate in the temple. And the highest ritual in that temple was the sealing of men and women together in marriage, including plural marriage. But women officiated in some of these ceremonies, blessing and anointing other women. And they considered themselves to be functioning under the authority of the holy priesthood. Now here's a fascinating document. This is a little, kind of like a little greeting card, a little token made by Eliza R. Snow to congratulate President Brigham Young and his lady, Presidentess Mary Ann Young, upon the altar of the Lord within his holy house. Their covenants were sealed, and there they plighted mutual vows. They had been sealed together for all eternity in the temple. Now, a few days later, Eliza would be sealed for time to Brigham Young, her plural husband, Joseph Smith, having died, and other women would be sealed to Brigham as well. It's a fascinating little document. I don't have time to describe it in great detail, but it involves two interlocking hearts, an arrow, and a an arrow and a key. The keys here of sealing people together in the temple. So the women are engaged in these rituals, but they're not allowed to meet separately. And interestingly, Eliza uses parallel terms. President Brigham Young and his lady, Presidentess Mary Ann Young, as the first wife. So we now, through ritual, have a new kind of authority, a kind of household authority, having lost the authority of office in the meetings, separate meetings of the Female Relief Society. Okay, so we're going to race through this somewhat. They leave Nauvoo. They're on the overland trail. They're dealing with all kinds of trouble and sorrow. And on the overland trail, as they're crossing Nauvoo to go to Iowa, there are a lot of deaths. And Phoebe Woodruff gives birth to a little baby that dies, and then very shortly around the same time, a child who had been born in England and had been painted in this portrait on her lap also dies. And she is distraught. And she is even more distraught when her husband is sealed by Brigham Young to a friend who had come with him from England and to two young girls. And it looks like trouble. What I describe here, and it's described very powerfully in the diaries that emerged from this period, diaries both of men and women, is what happens when you're coming out of the arduous task of building a temple, engaging in rituals that you believe are going to bring salvation, engaging in rituals that you believe defy those who challenge Joseph's authority to practice plural marriage. And you believe you are doing this because the second coming of Jesus is imminent. We're preparing a holy society where people are going to live together in love and peace and in communal order in the hereafter. And instead, you find yourself in the mud of Iowa and in a horrible refugee camp on the Missouri River and trying to find a new home. And people are miserable and in despair. And so what do the diaries tell us the women do? They gather together. They huddle together in cabins, in tents, in covered wagons, and they bless one another. They heal one another. They share prophecies, speaking in tongues. And they start with the small groups, and then one by one they build into larger, they spread it. One will go in another group and begin to teach this. No offices, no Relief Society, spiritual gifts. They begin to heal one another, and they begin to join together to reaffirm their identity as daughters of God. They move on. In the first dank winter in the Salt Lake Valley, apparently even in this cabin, which really doesn't look very promising and apparently had no windows. This is Rebecca Ryder's cabin. Levi and Rebecca Ryder built this cabin in the old fort. And people begin to wonder, what are these meetings that the women are holding? And someone joked, they're organized parties. having a good time, no problem here. The sisters together, but it becomes, they're concerned, by what authority do we meet together? There's no more Relief Society. They've always had spiritual gifts, but if we begin to organize, are we doing something different? And they resolve that in a very interesting way through the household authority of women who've been endowed in the temple and have this shared authority within the household. So they persuade Rebecca Riders that when they're in your cabin, you preside. And they use that term. Who is going to preside at this meeting? And when they go to another cabin, the woman there presides, and if she feels she cannot preside, she delegates someone else. And they do this through the winter and spring of 1848, as the men are often gone out exploring, building ditches, doing other things. So they're now in Utah. And what can women do? Without question, they take care of childbirth, right? And they take care of healing. This is part of the community of women, the female economy of women. And the Brethren recognize that. Willard Richards, who's a Thompsonian doctor of kinds, he recognizes that. And so they organize a council of health, which includes the midwives. And pretty soon Patty Sessions is a counselor in the Council of Health. And there's a midwives council and men's, and it's starting to look an awful lot like they're organizing meetings. But these are Council of Health meetings, even though witnesses who were there in the minutes tell us they sometimes speak in tongues as well as share recipes. And they definitely heal each other. They heal each other in these meetings. So something happens. There's trouble with Wakara, the Ute leader. There's violence. People are concerned. In conference, there's we got to do something. They tramp down the threat from Walker and the rebellion of the Utes, but they've decided we've got to go out now and convert the Paiutes, who are more friendly. We're going to start sending missionaries. And so in a conference, one of the brethren gives a sermon saying, things are getting a little better now. We're into the early 1850s. You're able to, you have better houses, and we're growing a little food, and now you really can help the Indians. Here's this theme of charity coming in. What if we were to do something to clothe the Indians? Well, that inspired Matilda Dudley, who was nobody. She had no particular calling. She wasn't married to an important man. She wasn't even married yet. And so she began to call her neighbors together to prepare clothing that they could send to help clothe the Paiute Indians in central Utah. And she decided they needed minutes for this meeting. And so they appointed a secretary, and they developed guidelines. And they called themselves, what else? The Indian Relief Society. That's in January. In June, Brigham Young, in a Sunday morning sermon, says, I have a great idea. Why don't the sisters get up relief societies to help clothe the Indians? And so he says to the bishops, let's have a relief society in each ward. Now, is this co-opting Matilda Dudley. Well, Matilda says, okay, sisters, now we're all going to meet in our own wards, and each ward is going to have a Relief Society, and she gets an office in her ward, and Patty becomes president in her ward, and other women. And pretty soon, lo and behold, we've got Relief Society back. Although the covenant in one of the wards, they had to kind of sign something. No one will speak ill of any of the authorities. So Relief Society comes back for a little while, and they begin to send clothing, so much clothing, that the missionaries can't distribute it all. There's just tremendous enthusiasm. And so Brigham Young said, well, maybe, sisters, you could begin to make carpet for the new tabernacle. And so they go to work in charitable works. And suddenly now we have a kind of benevolent society called a Relief Society. And the Council of Health continues, and the dancing school continues, and the Philosophical Society continues, and people are engaged in all kinds of informal organizations, men and women in the society. Well, I'm going to run out of time, but the fascinating thing that happens is after these Relief Societies get going, the men in the church historical office have been working and publishing in the Deseret News the early history of the church. And they decide that it's important that they include, guess what? The formation of the Nauvoo Relief Society in the history. And so they ask Eliza Snow if she will bring her minutes to the church headquarters, to the church historical department headquarters, and if they could borrow them for a couple of days to make copies of some of the sermons of Joseph Smith. And they do so, and according to the minutes of the church historical department, Heber Kimball and Brigham Young looked over these sermons, and they decided they're pretty good, but they could be better. And so they correct the minutes and publish them in the Deseret News. In Eliza's version, Joseph said he was going to make the society a kingdom of priests in Enoch's day as in Paul's day. And George A. Smith and his clerks changed that to, the Lord was going to make of the Church of Jesus Christ a kingdom of priests, a holy people, a chosen generation. In Eliza's version, Joseph spoke of delivering the keys to this society and to the church. In the Revised Version, he spoke of delivering the keys of the priesthood to the church and said that the faithful members of the Relief Society should receive them in connection with their husbands. Whereas the speech Eliza recorded enjoined the sisters to place confidence in the leaders they had chosen to lead their organization, the Revised Version told them to place confidence in their husbands, whom God has appointed for them to honor, and in those faithful men whom God has placed at the head of the church to lead his people. In the original version, Joseph said, I now turn the key to you and the name of God, and this society shall rejoice, and knowledge and intelligence shall flow down for this time. And in the Revised Version, Joseph said, I now turn the key in your behalf in the name of the Lord, and this society shall rejoice, and good things will happen for the poor and needy as you assist them. So we are now a charitable society to do good and to help the poor under the authority of bishops without the keys, and the authority of women comes through obedience to and listening to their husbands and to the brethren in the church. Now, I don't have time to go further with this, except to say fascinating things happened in this period of these nascent little Relief Societies. And one of the things that happened was another threat from the federal government, in this case what we know of as the Utah War, which stimulated a fascinating rash of patriotism by the women in support for the church against, they're struggling within the church, but they don't want to be tamped down from outside the church. This is their church, their community. They love the teachings of the church. They're working on both fronts. And the amazing 14th Ward album quilt, which is filled with emblems of the American eagle and with vows that we are going to assert our right of citizenships and we're going to stand up for the church and we're not going to let this happen. In God is our trust. So we have vibrant Relief Societies. We have equivocal authority for office and for separate women's organizations. We have such authority as people have is contingent upon harmonious relationships in families and their support for their husbands. We have patriarchy having reasserted itself in a very interesting way. And then the Utah War comes and the Relief Societies go away. And women turned toward home production again, toward manufacturing, toward having lots of babies. They're back again in that female economy that we started with. And they're doing all the things they were doing from the beginning, speaking in tongues, blessing one another, healing the sick, taking care of babies, taking care of their neighbors, taking care of the poor. But there's no sign that I can find of organized Relief Society in the early 1860s after this war. 1867, a new threat from outside. The new threat is the coming of the railroad, the coming of Gentile merchants, the loss of economic power in the territory by the Latter-day Saints, a serious threat which Brigham Young takes seriously. He wants to organize united orders. He wants to get people to boycott Gentile merchants. The sisters rally around him, and he decides maybe we need Relief Society. This time, however, they are prepared. And the two fabulous things happen. And, you know, it's hard to read between the lines. Obviously, they have managed to soften Brigham. They've also managed to take authority without seeming to, without overt resistance. So two interesting things happen. Sarah Kimball, who helped found the original Relief Society, is now president of the 15th Ward. She decides what the sisters need is independent, organized economic activity, and they need their own building. She raises the money from the sisters, buys the land, they hire a designer, they build the building. It's the Relief Society Hall, used for household production and marketing on the lower floor and for meetings on the upper floor. That's the first thing. The second thing that happens is Eliza Snow begins to send letters all over the territory to newly appointed Relief Society presidents, giving them models based on the original minutes of the Nauvoo Relief Society. They begin to call officers. Some of these wards, they have deacons and teachers. They have treasurers. They have people responsible for marketing and for evaluating products that they're selling. They come in wholeheartedly around the idea of opposing the Gentile merchants. But they've now come back with their own organization. And it is in the upper room, in the 15th Ward Relief Society Hall, where women from throughout Salt Lake gather together to plan the opposition meeting that they mount in 1870 against the anti-polygamy legislation in conference. And they pass resolutions for what they want from Congress, and they add, by vote, they will ask the territorial legislature for the vote. They will have citizenship. They get the vote. They meet in the Relief Society Hall to evaluate the indignation meeting, which was an amazing success. Got national press everywhere. They stood up. They defended polygamy and their church, and they got the vote. And then Sarah Kimball said, I am ready to declare myself a women's rights woman. And Phoebe Woodruff said, I have been waiting for years for this moment. They appoint Bathsheba Smith to tour the territory with her husband to preach the importance of retrenchment, home manufacturers, and women's rights if she wishes. And she did. And from that point on, women become committed to a national movement of political and economic rights for women. And the Relief Society, at long last, after 2 decades of starting and stopping, is established as a permanent organization that continues to the end of the 19th century with amazing success in both the economic, the cultural, and the spiritual sphere. Well, I've gone on too long, but that's my story. I think you've got the 10 items of illustration from the book. We'll stop there, and thank you very much.